on that note, we will move to local politics. As Tip O'Neill said, all politics is local. So we're going to the city council here of Los Angeles. People may remember, I think this was last year at this time, Kevin de Leon, the guy who was in the city council who got caught in all these racist tapes with other officials in Los Angeles. All the rest of them resigned. He did not resign. He's actually continuing to try to run again. Maybe unfortunately for him, he's drawing quite a number of opponents, one of whom is Lalo Vargas, who is a socialist candidate for District 14 on the Los Angeles City Council. Lalo, thank you so much for joining us here on the show.
Thank you, Eugene and Rania. It's really humbling to be here.
Well, it's really great to have you here. You are running in a district that probably is more famous than many city council districts around the country because of what took place there with the, I guess, current and perhaps former city council member. But before we get into any of that, I mean, talk to us about what your vision is. I mean, you're running as a socialist explicitly for the city council there in Los Angeles. Talk to us about, you know, what that means and what your vision is for the residents of District 14.
Right. So my campaign is taking place in a district that has been one of the most oppressed ones in all of Los Angeles. We are the epicenter of the housing crisis with one of the largest proportions of evictions in the city. And so the very first point of our platform is that housing is a human right. Because a city as wealthy as Los Angeles, one of the wealthiest metropolitan areas in the whole world, has all of the resources to house everybody, but is not doing so. And it's not because of a lack of resources, but because of a lack of leadership from the working class themselves, who could harness the enormous capacity of the city to actually get people housed. We also need to put an end to racist police terror. We know that some of the most oppressed communities are also some of the heaviest ones experiencing policing. And we also need to expand worker protections and workers' rights, raise the minimum wage. We also need a special focus on environmental justice. In our district, we've suffered contamination from corporations. We have trash and other kinds of waste that contaminates the air and the soil. And we also need to look at expanding and making a free public transit system because so many people, I mean, LA is famous for its traffic, but we could make LA a city where people can get around regardless of their ability or of their age. And people still do depend a lot on the public transit system. However, it's failing in a lot of ways as well.
You're also a high school science teacher, which is pretty cool. It's not often you have someone who's in like a public school teacher running for office. I'm curious if you could talk a bit about why that is actually like a extra sort of qualification.
Right. So I'm in my break room right now. You guys got me at a good time. I'm a teacher of AP Environmental Science. So, you know, I was just talking about some of the environmental issues we have. I spend a lot of time talking with our youth about some of the policies that we could be implementing at the local level in our local community that the city could actually take on. On top of being a teacher, I mean, I see a lot of the failures of the government because unfortunately, we as teachers are expected to pick up a lot of the slack and deal with, you know, we're the first stop for healthcare, mental health care, to ensuring that students are fed and housed. And that's a lot to put on teachers and counselors. And even with everyone doing as much as they can, sometimes families and kids fall through the cracks. So I see a lot of the suffering through my lens as a teacher. But I also, when I clock out, I am also a tenant organizer. And so for me, being a socialist candidate isn't something that I do in names only. It's also in actions. I have helped organize tenants to form tenants associations, tenants unions, so that they can actually defend against landlord harassment, abuses when their rents are not being respected. This is all important so that people feel that they have a place to go to, a mechanism through which they can actually get some of the demands that they need and make those a reality. Because without that component, a socialist candidate like me doesn't really have a chance against the political establishment.
You know, I have to say I was pretty surprised to see that Kevin de Leon was going to run for re-election after, you know, his just unbelievable involvement in this racist statements. I mean, talk about how important it is for you to be running in the race with this having just happened, this major event which roiled the city of Los Angeles, and where these unfortunate comments, I think, you know, maybe created some distrust on both sides between Central American communities, Black communities, and others. How important is it for you to address some of this as you run in this campaign?
I think this is the question that has been on a lot of people's minds is Kevin de Leon going to retain his seat? And if not, then the question is who will replace him? I think that we're ready to go beyond just a referendum that's anti-De Leon. This campaign is proposing to people that there's an alternative to the Democratic Party, to all of these politicians that have failed us time and again. When we look at the biggest issue, as I said, on everyone's mind is housing. And many of the Democratic candidates, including De Leon himself, but including Carrillo and Miguel Santiago, they're being funded by some of the same interests as Kevin de Leon. They're accepting money from real estate law firms that defend landlords, property owners, property managers. So what we're saying is any of these politicians cannot possibly bring solutions for the housing crisis in Los Angeles because they're actually benefiting from the exploitation and from people being pushed out of their homes and from the displacement. So we cannot trust them any longer. So the alternative is a working class candidate, a socialist candidate. What was troubling about that audio that was leaked was also, of course, the comments, but also that these some former and the current incumbent Kevin de Leon council members, which were using their power to try to influence the redistricting process to favor their power, not necessarily the needs of working people. And you hear them talking about breaking up renter populations so that they have more homeowner districts so that renters' voices are disenfranchised. All of this points to a larger strategic goal, I think, of them holding on to power that represents the interests of the wealthy. And what we're saying is that it doesn't matter if it was a Democrat majority in the city council as we have now. 14 seats are controlled by Democrats out of the 15. And it doesn't matter if those were all Republican seats. We would be having the same exact issues because those seats are controlled by people who represent the interests of the wealthy. On the other hand, I'm not taking money from any of the big corporations, CEOs. My campaign is fully funded by the working class, small dollar donations. And that's actually how we're able to get even so much more done than some of these other candidates that have all these resources at their disposal. We're already canvassing significant portions of the district on very small resources. And that is owed to the fact that we have a dedication not to money or to power, but to the working class of the city.
I have a question that always gets asked, and I know it's a bit of an obnoxious question, but you, of course, are not a Democrat or a Republican. You are running outside of that two-party framework. And a lot of people get very upset about this, or I'll get a little curious about the idea of third parties. Of course, you're running in a very blue area where it's pretty much Democrat dominated. I think you can tell me if I'm wrong with that, unless something's changed in LA. But can you talk a little bit about the significance of you running on a third party ticket as opposed to running under a Democrat or Republican banner?
Yeah, I'm the only socialist running for District 14. All of the other candidates are either from the Democratic Party or they're not identifying as a socialist. And again, I think that's very important. This is a district that has historically supported Bernie Sanders during presidential elections. This is a side of Los Angeles that has, not this district specifically, but some of the neighboring neighborhoods have elected somebody who describes themselves as an abolitionist to the city council. And I think that people are getting to a point where they are honestly tired of the same things happening in the political establishment. They know that nothing really will fundamentally change, no matter which Democrat is in office. And people are also disengaged from the electoral process because they don't see the point of voting, of having to choose between two people that don't represent their interests. So I think us proposing my campaign, my candidacy as a real alternative, somebody from the working class that will have nothing to lose really from putting the needs of working class families first, I think that can re-engage a lot of people and get them back into, taking interest into who their actual representative is. And that can actually bring out a lot of people to vote as well.
Mm-hmm. You already mentioned it to some degree here, and I want to just touch on it again in terms of important issues. Housing is certainly big, and I think very much tied to that is this issue of public safety that's been put forward. I know that the mayor recently, raised the salaries for the LAPD and is saying that she wants to bring in more police officers. I think this is on a lot of people's minds in big cities around the country. How do you suggest that issue be addressed, if you even think it's an issue at all, to the extent it's become such a flashpoint in so many elections in California and elsewhere?
Right. So you're absolutely right. The city council approved a raise to the police budget and their contracts, meaning that they're going to receive an increase of almost $1 billion over the next 4 years. Meanwhile, our departments in the rest of the city, such as housing and building and safety, they are not receiving increases to a similar degree. And so what we're looking at is that there are alternatives to policing that would actually keep us safe. I mentioned earlier that some of the poorest communities are the most heavily policed ones. And there are also some of the places where people don't feel safe, where people feel actually afraid of the police themselves. I'm a member of the Party for Socialism and Liberation, and so a lot of our political platforms for this campaign come from our party's perspective on how policing should be dealt with in a socialist society. We believe that everybody deserves to feel safe in their neighborhoods. However, when we're funding a police budget with over a quarter of the city's budget and it's still not keeping us safe, then we have to look at actual alternatives. One of the things that we think a socialist in city council can actually support the community with is with infrastructure, such as violence interruption programs, where we actually support community leaders who know their community best to start to actually become the voices and the people who know what solutions are actually needed in their community. We also know that some of the heaviest police communities, some of the most violent ones, are ones where people don't have their basic necessities, access to housing, healthcare, childcare. Whereas in those communities that are the safest, those are often the wealthiest ones that have all of their needs guaranteed, not necessarily the ones that have cops on every single block. So we are envisioning a real partnership with community leaders that can actually, and alongside, providing the basic necessities of life to people who work in Los Angeles, who right now are not having their basic needs guaranteed because it's hard to live in Los Angeles, even if you're working 2 jobs. And I mean, I know people, and I have had to say goodbye to students who are moving as far away as Victorville, which is on the other side of the mountains here in LA. And their parents are still working in Los Angeles, commuting over 3 hours both ways, meaning that their work week eventually turns into a 70-hour work week. There's no excuse for that in one of the wealthiest cities in the world. So, the policing question is important, but I think, it can't be discussed without discussing also the component of having the basic rights guaranteed for working families.
Yeah, I mean, a couple other things in your platform that stick out that are totally connected to what you just said. And even when I think about LA and when I visit, what I'm kind of whoa about is the fact that the public transportation is not very good, and the traffic is insane. Like you just mentioned, a 3-hour trip. A lot of that is probably also due to traffic, but also the housing issue. I mean, LA is known for having a crazy amount of homelessness in Skid Row, but also it's one of the most expensive cities in the country in terms of rent. So can you talk a little bit about the issue of housing? And you are a tenant organizer as well. So I imagine you know quite a lot about that, as well as the issue of public transportation.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I know sometimes in the popular media, LA is billed as this sunshine city with palm trees and actors and movie stars everywhere. But, the reality on the ground is very different. There is around over 40,000 homeless people living in LA. Skid Row is actually in my district, in District 14, and that's the epicenter. This is a humanitarian crisis. It's not only famous nationwide, but I think worldwide, because you have actually, there's a city within a city, a city of homeless people living next to opulent wealth and riches. And so that's really the biggest injustice here. We also, we know that there are more empty housing units in Los Angeles than there are homeless people. The number of empty housing units is closer to 90 or 100,000, depending on which estimates we're looking at. And so a city council like the Los Angeles City Council has the power to take those empty units, seize them, and redistribute them to the people to guarantee housing as a right. But, we also need to prevent people from becoming homeless. And that involves creating structures in the community, such as tenant organizations, which I'm proud to have been a part of in both Los Angeles and in the surrounding areas, because what ends up happening is that the city's housing and building and safety departments have a backlog of cases that they need to investigate, or backlog of inspections. And without the proper leadership, the proper funding in these departments, they end up neglecting tenants and tenants' rights, and they're not enforcing the laws that they're supposed to be to protect tenants. And so what ends up happening is that, de facto, these departments are servicing the interests of the landlords, of the property owners. And we think that with the proper leadership, the proper funding in these departments, an overhaul of them so that they're staffed with people who have experienced tenant organizing, community leaders who are tenants themselves, then we can actually turn these departments into people's departments that are actually serving the needs of regular working people first. And that provides opportunities for tenants to actually have their rights respected. And also, we think that penalties can be higher on landlords that aren't providing adequate housing, and those penalties can even include seizure of their property, so that the tenants who are actually living there, who are paying their rent on time, but who have unhealthy living conditions, they can actually take ownership over their housing. And that way we can have more stable communities in Los Angeles, and it's more affordable for working families. The people who live here and who work here should be able to afford to live here. But with rents skyrocketing, it's becoming less and less of a possibility for most families today.
Mm-hmm. Well, Lalo, before we let you go, for those who may be more curious about what you have going on, where can they find more information about your campaign?
All of my social media handles are Lalo4CD14. And we actually have, a lot of people tell me, I wish I could vote for you, but I don't live in District 14. People can also donate to our campaign so that we can take on some of the biggest names in the political establishment. We actually have a deadline coming up tomorrow. So that website is lalo4cd14.com. You'll find all the information there.
Right on. Lalo Vargas, socialist candidate for the Los Angeles City Council in District 14 and a working teacher. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Pleasure to be here.